Hello everyone, welcome to my first tutorial. My goal is to teach people about Designer in a way I wish I had learned from the start. By explaining the process and keeping it simple and working your way up. There are many ways to create the same thing in Designer, so the most important thing is learning the concepts and the tools available. I hope everyone can take away something from this tutorial and enjoy their start with Substance Designer. Alright, so let's begin. So to get started, if you're following along, um, I already have a template here, but if you have it, you can go to New, go to Substance Graph, and then I'm using the first or the second choice, Metallic Roughness. So name your graph, whatever you'd like, and then hit OK. I keep it at 2K, and that should be fine. And then you should start with these outputs. So we're going to move them over to the side to get started. Alright, so we're going to be making some tiles. As you know, everybody loves tiles. So to get started, we're going to, you can right click and hit add node, or you can hit spacebar, and we're going to look for tile sampler. So you'll get this big boy here. We're going to move them all the way over here to give ourselves some room to work with. Now the tile sampler is a very important tool in Substance Designer. It does a lot of things, and today we're going to be using some of those things. We're going to use only a few of them, like 1% of everything that this thing can do. So right off the bat, we're just going to plug this in to kind of give ourselves something to visualize in the 3D view here. So we're going to pull from this. We're going to click and drag by selecting this output node, and then we're going to type in levels. I will explain what a level does a little later, but just for now, just trust me on this. And then we're going to drag this guy all the way to the right side. And then we are going to plug him into our height. And we're going to select this guy here, and we're going to delete him. We're going to drag from the levels, and we are going to type in ambient for ambient occlusion. And there's two of them, just to give you a quick rundown. There's HBAO and RTAO. The RT in the second one here stands for ray tracing. This one is more expensive, so I typically use this one. I forgot what it stands for, but horizon based. There it is in the description. All right, so we're gonna go with the HBAO, as I like to call it, and we're gonna delete the uniform one here as well. We're gonna move this in here, and then we're gonna plug it in, and then you should be getting something like this. And then we're gonna plug this levels into the normal node that leads into the normal output. Now we are working with DirectX. If you don't know what this is, don't worry about it. Just make sure that your normals are set to DirectX if you're following along. Sometimes people will use OpenGL. Okay, so now we're able to see, now that we've plugged in our into our outputs, we're able to see our tile sampler. So it's just a bunch of squares. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to click this tab over here, Scene, and then we are going to change it to plain high res. I think it stands for high resolution. We're going to hit that, and then it's going to give us a plane with a lot of vertices, so that we can displace the plane based on our height information that we've plugged in here. Now the other thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the Material tab next to Scene. We're going to go to Default and then go to Edit. In some versions of Designer, you have to go to Material, Default, go to what rendering settings you're using, which the one you should be using will have a check mark next to it, and then go to Tessellation and Displacement, and it'll bring you to this. Yours might look a little different, but the names will be the same. So we're looking at we're looking for height scale and tessellation factor. Well, actually, we'll come back to this. I want to show you, I want to visualize it for you. But let's do something real quick here. We're going to double click the tile sampler, and we are going to change how many tiles there are. So by default, when you spawn the tile sampler, it starts at 16 by 16. We're going to turn this down to 4 by 4. And then you can see here that in the 3D viewport, there's less. There's a 4 by 4 grid now, which is what we want. Okay, so now let's go back to materials, default. I'm going to hit edit. And then I want to talk about these two settings real quick. So the height scale basically changes the height scale. Let me open up Paint here and see if I can explain to you what's happening. So everything in Simpsons Designer works in a gradient where black obviously is 0 and white is 1. So when we increase the height scale, what we're basically doing is we're moving the scale between 0 and 1. So if this is the highest a material can go, 1, it can't go past 1. And we increase the height scale, it makes it so that 1 is actually up here. So we're able to deform the geometry more. So to show that, if we go to the side view here, this is as white as it gets, and this is as black as it gets. Right now, it's just white or black, 0 or 1. So if 1's up here, and we increase the height scale, basically it increases where 1 is. So it's still 1 to 0, but 1 is up here and 0 is down here. So it's still the same, it just gives you more, you're increasing the scale. So we're going to change this to 2.5, just so that we can visualize our tiles a little bit better. And then the other thing to worry about is tessellation factor, but I'll show that a little bit later because it'll be hard to tell with what we have now. Okay, so next we're going to create some tiles and we want to make them bigger because people would trip because there's a big gap in between them. So if you double click the tile sampler, below where we were changing the amount of tiles, we get a couple tabs like pattern, size, position. So under size, there's a setting called scale. We can turn this up a little bit. Don't go past 1, otherwise they'll connect. Let's go with like, I don't know, 0.97. So now you can see that they're tighter together. Now, before we move on, we're going to come back here to our normal node and we're going to change this to 5. It'll make things a little easier to see. If you double click this, actually you can't really tell because right now it's a very harsh fall off, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so let's go back over here real quick and turn down our ambient occlusion because the spacing between the tiles right now it's black and it makes it hard to work with. So we're going to turn down the height scale of our ambient occlusion to like 0.005. And we're still getting some ambient occlusion. You can see some shadowing here, but now it doesn't think it's as deep. And then we're going to also change our roughness output. Select the uniform color. Make sure it's using grayscale. And then we're going to change this to 0.5 to make it easier to see so it's not so reflective. Alright. Now we can get into the fun stuff. So the first thing we want to do is add a small bevel to the edges of our tiles. So right now our tiles are like, oops, are like this. So it's a 90-degree angle here. What we want to do is make it do this. We want to give it a little bevel so that it doesn't have such a hard fall off. So if we drag off the tile sampler and we type in bevel, it will do just that for us. By default, it's set to 0.5. It's usually too high. So we're going to turn this down a little bit, but we're going to connect the output of height into our levels so that we can see what's happening. So let me just angle this. Okay, so by default, it was set to 0.5. And you can see what it's doing a little bit there. We're going to drag it the other way. Now this node, this distance value here, can go into the negative. So if we look into our 2D viewport, if we go back into the positive, it basically bevels outward. But if you go into the negative, it bevels inward. Bevels inward, which is what we want. So then here you can see that it's doing what we wanted, except it is beveling from the top all the way to the bottom, so you get one continuous slope. And what we want is, so right now it's doing this, where this is 0 and this is 1. But we want this to be like 0 here, 1 here, and then like, this is not to scale, but like 0.75 here. But right now it's giving us this one. So we need to, how do I explain this? We need to raise the slope, the bevel to be up here, not all the way down here. So to do that, we're gonna drag off of the tile sampler again, and we're gonna type in blend. Every time you're trying to mix things together in Designer, you will be using a blend. This is a blend node. This is it's like the bread and butter of Designer. All right, so we're gonna drag this height from the bevel and put it on the top input node, which is called the foreground. The middle one's called the background, and then the third one down here is opacity. And I'll touch more on what that means later on. But basically, a good rule of thumb that I've found so far is that usually when your existing pattern or whatever it is you're working on will usually go in the background, and then whatever you're blending into it will usually go on the foreground. Sometimes, depending on what blend mode you use, if you double click the blend node, just like Photoshop, which I know very little of, there's different blending modes you can do. So depending on what you're doing, sometimes it doesn't matter which way they're connected, like multiplication, right? It doesn't matter what's in front of what, because multiplication is all the same. Just a quick little tip, if you box select these two spaghetti strands here and then hit X, it'll swap the input, so you don't have to like, disconnect and then redo that. Select them and hit X. Okay, so now that we have that, we are going to leave our blend mode to copy, and we are going to turn down this slider here. But before we do that, we're actually going to connect it so that we can see it in the 3D viewport, so we can see it here. Now, before we spin around here, we're going to go back to the material tab, go to default, go to edit, and then we're going to change our tessellation factor now to like 6. If you have a high-end computer, you can probably go up to like 16, maybe even higher, but I tend to just use 6 or 8. Um, so we're gonna go with a 6. So with tessellation factor is it gives us more detail to work with. So by default it's set to 1. You can see the jaggedness. So if we increase, we get smoother topology. So now we're able to better visualize our bevel. Something else we can do here is go to camera and then go to edit selected. It might look different in your version, but this should still be there some way, somehow. And we're going to change our projection to orthographic. And then we're going to go to camera and we're going to go down, we're just going to select any of these. So now we can see our bevel and we can see what's happening here. So now if we or I guess lower our opacity, we can increase the height of our bevel. If we go back to bevel and we mess with our distance here, so let's do like negative 0.02, you can change the the slope of your bevel. So I think that's a little too much. Let's go like 0.015, and then let's change this to like 0.5. Maybe we go lower. Something like that. Okay. We're gonna always come back and fix it. I did make like a preview of this before I started the tutorial, so I might pause the video and go back and just make sure we're on the right track. Okay. So right now our tiles are looking very perfect. They're perfectly gridded. So we're gonna break that up by going back into a tile sampler, and we're going to just kind of add a little bit of variation to make it look a little bit more natural. So let us scroll down to position, and here we have position random. So if I double click the tile sampler, we can see what our tiles look like in this stage of the material or texture. And then if we increase our position random, it randomly positions our tiles all over the place. So obviously we don't want this. So we just want to be very subtle about it. So we're going to do 0.0, I don't know, let's do 1, see what that's like. Okay, that's a little better, but I think it's still a little too much, so we're going to cut that in half. So we'll make that 0.005. Now, unless these people didn't have any type of measuring tool, I don't think they'd be too far off, but let's go with like 0.004. Now, it's all about the detail. It's all about the variation. It's all about how natural it looks. So it's always good to pay attention to the little details as much as you do the big ones. What else can we do? We can maybe give it a little bit of rotation. Very, very, very little. So let's start with 0.01. That's a little too much. So let's do 0.0025. Maybe even that's a little too much. Let's get rid of the 5. Maybe half that. Okay. So we've done position random, we've done rotation random. Let's do a little bit of size variation here. So that not every tile is the same perfect. This would be, if they're using cutting tools, then this should be pretty accurate. So we're just gonna make the variation just a tiny little bit. Okay, and then let's change our projection for the camera to perspective again. Let's tone down the rotation random by half, so 0.0005. Okay, we're getting started. All right, so now we're gonna chip away at our tiles. These are going to be some worn down tiles, so some of them are going to be chipped and broken. So to do that, we need to cut away, or another word for cutting away, subtract. So, like I said in my intro, there's a lot of ways to do the same thing, and just what I'm about to show you is one way of doing it. So what we're going to do is going to drag off the tile sampler, and we are going to type in flood fill. Flood fill is another very powerful node that lets you do a lot of things procedurally. And basically what it does is it takes all the islands, so anything that's separated with black, and gives it its own identity basically. And you can see, because you can see it repeats. If these islands were double click, if these islands were touching, then it would look like this. So I'm gonna double click flood fill so that I can visualize it, but then I'm gonna single click tile sampler so that I can change the settings without changing the viewport. Very important. And I'm gonna increase the position random. So here you can see that there's a dividing line between these two islands, therefore they each have their own identity. But this guy, they're touching. So Floodfill thinks that it's one big chunk, which I guess in reality it is. But obviously that's not what we want. So we're gonna undo that, and that should bring us back to a position random of 0.004. Alright, now we're gonna pull from Floodfill, and if you type in Floodfill, it gives you all the options that you can do with Floodfill. And we are looking for the Floodfill to gradient. Now what this does is it gives each tile or each island a gradient from 1 to 0. And by default, they're all facing the same way. So what we're going to do is, in the Floodfill to gradient node, there is a setting called angle variation, which will vary the angle. Or is that a word? I guess vary the angle. So we're going to increase this all the way up so that we get the most variation between them. If you're not happy with your results, you can also change the degree or the angle. So for example, these four guys are kind of all sloping in the same direction. If you don't like the result you're getting, you can mess around with the angle variation again. Or you can change the seed. Most nodes in Substance Designer have a setting here called random seed that will, I guess, randomize your output. So if we, not your output, but like, the node. So if we change this from 0 to 1, you get another, what's called seed. Alright, so I'm going to go with this one. Now that we have this is going to give us our cutaway. We're going to cut into our tiles using this. So if we drag on from this blend and we type in blend, and like I said before, since this is the main track, this is going to go into the middle, and then this is going to go on top, because we're trying to subtract this value. We're trying to subtract it from this one. So put this in the foreground, and then we're going to change the blend mode to subtract because we're trying to cut away. And let's just plug this in so that we can visualize it. So you can see that something is happening here with our tiles. Not exactly what we wanted. So let's see what else we can do. So we want the cut of the stone to be, harsh, right? Like a piece came off. So if we select this spaghetti strand here, and then hit spacebar or right click, and we type in scan, we will get this node called histogram scan. This is a very useful node. By default, when you spawn it, it starts at 0 and 0. What you want to do is, if you want to get it to look like your input, change your position to 0.5. This is basically the default position. So if you double click this, and then you double click this, they look the same. So I think this is what the starting position should be. So something important to note, 0.5 on the position and contrast at 0 is technically the default position. Probably a reason why it's not, but okay. So now what histogram scan does, I'll show you. We're going to zoom in here, and first we're going to move the contrast up. So here is 0 in the bottom left corner of this tile, and then the top right is 1. So if we increase our contrast, this is now 1. This, you can see there's a bit of a line here. This is 1, and this is 0. So what's happening here is we're decreasing everything in between 1 and 0 is what's considered grayscale. So what we're doing with contrast is we're shrinking the slope, the gradient, or the grayscale. So if we turn this all the way up, you just have 1 or 0. So if you look at the 3D viewport, you can see what it's doing. So now we're subtracting 100% of 1. So something you should get used to is trying to find where you're at in your viewport. So for example, if we go here and I'm looking at this tile here on the second column, second row, I guess B2, this guy here, and then we look over here, this is the tile, the cut that corresponds to that one. So we're cutting the top right corner from this tile, which gives us this, because we're subtracting the white. We're subtracting the white from the white, which gives us just this, and it makes that top right corner there black. So the other thing that the histogram scan node does is position. What this does basically is we can increase or decrease. We're going to move the contrast back to 0, and you're going to see here what it's doing. It's increasing the white or lowering the white. So if we go back to 0.5, and then we could go back to the contrast being this way. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click our latest blend node, and then I'm going to click the histogram scan node once so that I can continue to look at what's happening here, but I can change the settings on this one. So here's our tile, and then we're going to go over here. We're going to go to camera, we're going to go to top view, and then we're going to find this tile B2, right? So that's this guy here. So I'm going to zoom in on this guy, and then while clicking once on histogram scan, we're going to increase, or actually we're going to decrease the position because we don't want to cut our entire tile, we just want to chip it. So we're going to go about there. So now you can see that all of our tiles are randomly being cut somewhere. Now, because the gradient is random, some chips are going to be bigger than others, and obviously they're going to be in different rotations. So if we were to change our variation down again, and then increase our position, then they would all be cut in the same spot, which obviously we don't want that. So we're going to increase our variation again, and then we're going to lower our position because we just want to chip it around the corners and stuff. So let's go with like 0.075. Just attempting numlock. Okay. Okay, so we're going to make this one 0.01. Sorry, not 0.01, 0.1. And then we are going to select these two nodes here. We're going to copy paste. And then we're going to copy paste this guy. And we are going to continue. So we're going to drag this output and put it into the middle. And then we're going to grab this histogram scan, the second one that we copied, and put it into the top slot again. And since we copied and pasted, it keeps our blending mode to subtract. And then we're going to plug this back over here. And we're going to keep our graph nice and neat so you guys can follow along. And right now we're basically doing the same thing on it. So that's not what we want. We want to do, the goal here is to do, this is our big cut, and then we're going to do like medium cuts and then like little cuts. So if we go back to our flood fill to gradient, and you remember the seed thing I mentioned, right now they're using the same seed, so there's no difference between these two, which means everything that comes afterwards is the same. So we're going to go to the new one, and we're going to change our seed to, I don't know, let's go to the next one. So let's go to 2. So instantly you see here in your 3D viewport that it changes because now we're doing different cuts in different corners. So if you double click here, you can see what these cuts look like and then what the old cuts look like. So now we have this. So now we're kind of just adding more cuts. Now these cuts are super clean, right? The fall off is like super harsh. So something we can do here that's really useful that I didn't learn until not too long ago is if you select a node and then hold and then press Shift D, so hold Shift and then press D, you can disable that node from the chain, and the chain will continue, but it'll exclude, the one you excluded there. I guess it's kind of like hiding it. I guess it doesn't go into the calculations. So we're going to disable the second one here, and we are going to double click the first blend here and click the scan once, and we're going to zoom in, and we don't want the cut to be this clean, so we're going to remove some of the contrast, so we're getting some of that gradient back. So let's do, I don't know, 0.925. So we want it to kind of look like it's been chipped off, broken off. And then we're going to click the second blend mode here for the cut. So we're going to bring it back same way by pressing hold shift, press D, and bring it back. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to give it the same contrast value of 0.925. 0.925. So that it looks a little smoother, a little cleaner, and not so like completely straight edge cut. Okay. Now we're going to add one more. Actually, right now these cuts are the same size, so we're going to go to the second one that we did, and we're going to lower the position a little bit. I don't know, let's do like 0.075. Oops. Maybe like 7. Okay, and then we're going to copy paste one more time. Boom. Don't forget to change your seed to something something else. We're going to drag from it. We're going to type in blend. We're going to do this the manual way. I'm just going to plug this on top, and then I'm going to select both of these strands and swap them. Change it to subtract. Plug it in. Position it. And then we're going to make these 0.05 to get even smaller cuts. So if we disable these two guys, we can see the tiny cuts that we just the new cuts. Let's bring these back. For this one, we're doing a 0.9 on the contrast for the third cut. Alright, looking good. We're getting somewhere. Now, the next thing we want to do, actually, I'm going to pause the video here and go back to my material that I made earlier so that I know where we can go next. So 1 second. Alright, and we're back. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is add a bit of edge wear. Because right now all of our tiles are, they're not worn at all, besides the cut. So we're going to zoom out a little bit, grab these guys, and we are going to drag them to the left, just to give us some more room to work with here. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to do here. We want to add some imperfections. We're going to cut away on the edges, similar to what we did here, but we want to make it more like worn rather than cut. But we're still going to subtract a value from the tiles. So, like everything, there are similar ways to do this, but I'm going to show you one simple way. It has some advanced techniques in there, or intermediate, but I think one of the most important things is just knowing what tools exist. Because if you know what tools exist, then you know what's possible, and then you can find your way to the solution. If you don't know the tool, you're going to have a harder time getting to the solution. Okay, so we are going to drag off our latest blend, and we're going to do another blend. Now, Substance Designer has a lot of noises or noise textures that come with it. One of them is called Crystal. There's Crystal 1 and Crystal 2. We're going to go with Crystal 1 here. This is a very good node to give you a jaggedy noise. When I say noise, I usually mean like a random grayscale texture, just noisy. Another popular one, or one of my other favorites, is the Clouds 2. Just a random noise, but this one's a little smoother. It's a little bit more, like clouds. Okay, so with this crystal node, let's move things down a little bit, keep ourselves organized and clean. Very important when you're first starting out. Once you become more knowledgeable, you can go crazy and have spaghetti all over the place. Okay, so basically what we want to do, like I said, is we're still going to subtract. So we're gonna, since we're subtracting this from our main path here, we're gonna put the crystal one on top, and our main one in the middle. And we're going to subtract again, and you can see here what it's doing, and we're going to plug this in just so that we can visualize it. Boom. Alright, we're done. If only it was that simple. I know when I was starting out, I always wanted things to just work the way I wanted it in my head. But that can get frustrating fast, because it's not always that easy. Okay. So this is basically what we want to do, but now we have to tweak it to get it more to what we want. So the next thing we want is we want to add our damage to the edges of the tiles. So we need to find a way to tell this crystal text noise to only subtract on the edges. So this is another important tool to have. Substance designer is a lot about problem solving. You have a problem and you're like, okay, how can I get what I need? What are my tools? Okay, so there's a lot of things to cover here. Okay, so let's start with something, the things that we know already. So for example, the histogram scan. So obviously we don't want this, or maybe you do, but I'm going to click the spaghetti here and I'm going to just write scan again to get to our histogram scan. And I'm going to change our position to 0.5, and I'm just going to mess with the contrast. So by reducing the gradient and just kind of focusing it a little bit, we get this, which, you know, already starting to look like damage, which is what you want. Okay, so this is our first step here. So we went from, you know, this, which is wrinkled paper, to less wrinkly paper. Okay. Now, next thing. If we hide this for now, actually, let's do one more thing. Let's bring these tiles a little closer. I think the gap between them is a little too much. So let's go here and let's change our scale to 0.985, just to bring them a little bit closer. Okay, now let's unhide this. Okay, so if we zoom in here, well, let's zoom out. Let's find this spot. Okay, so right here. It's gonna be hard to find. Okay, so it's like halfway through these two here. So here's these two, halfway through. Okay, right here. So if we look at the original noise, you have this shape here that cuts into two tiles. Now, unless these tiles came from one big slab and then cut into it with the damage already on it, then this wouldn't happen. Because then you would also have to assume that the tiles were all laid in the original orientation from the slab, which is usually not how it's done, right? You cut the slabs, you cut the tiles, and then you place the tiles, and sometimes you'll rotate them. So you don't want this noise. This is a very important concept. You don't want this noise to continue over to this tile, because that's just, I mean, you could leave it, but removing this makes you less of a beginner, which is what our goal here. So you can see here that this shape continues onto this one. We don't want that. So how do we fix that? So let's unhide this. And there are two ways that I see people do this. The main one is there's two types of warp nodes. So I'm going to show you the fancy way, which I think is a little better because it gives you more randomization. So there's directional warp, and then there's vector warp. I used to do this for the longest time, but then I have a friend who is a professional, a god at substance designer, and he suggested I use this one. And I did a comparison, and I do like this one better. So we need a vector warp grayscale. But in order for this node to work, we need color value. We need RGB. So if you look, this one's gray because it's taken grayscale input. So it's taking anything between 1 and 0, black and white. And then this one means, like I said, color. So a grayscale would not fit in there. So what we need to do is similar to what we did here for our flood fill to gradient. We're going to do another flood fill thing. We're going to drag from here and put it down here. And we are going to do flood fill to random color. So same thing, flood fill, you know, it's taking my islands, my white islands, and it is assigning them a random color. So you can see that the spaghetti here is orangey. So then we know that this can plug into here. But there's one more thing we need to do. There's a node called, if I spell it correctly, distance. And basically what this does is you'll see here, I'm going to plug this into here. And then I'm going to change the maximum distance to, I don't know, we're just going to do 5,000. I always do something high to make sure that it's doing what I need it to do. Now, we need to put something else on top. We're going to put in our original pattern. So if we double click the foot filter random color, it does this. We still have our in between, our black in between. What distance does is it takes all the pixels or our most outer pixels and it just pushes them outward all together, which makes it so that they meet in, in the middle. So you get this, which is like airtight, which is what we want. So now with this, we can plug this into here. Boom, like that. And then we are actually going to put this in here and then this in here. So that looks like this. Before it was this. But we want to put this in between the crystal and the histogram scan. Now, the reason why we want... Actually, technically this could go after, but I'd rather have it here just to be safer, and I'll explain why. So what the vector warp grayscale does, if we zoom in here, you can see that it's taking the edges of this. So you can see here the shape. Also, another quick helpful tip. If you double click the input, it'll show you where it's coming from or what's connected into it. So if we double click this one, it'll show us this. If we double click this and we follow the spaghetti, it shows us this. This is useful because sometimes, when you start doing complex graphs and you have this, let's say, all the way over here, and you're like, okay, well, what is this again? And then you have to like drag all the way to it. With this, you're able to just, oh, okay, it's this. Oh, this is this. Okay, and it helps you keep yourself organized and know what's what and where it's coming from. Okay, so if we turn down, by default, it starts with 1 intensity, our vector warp scale, grayscale. So if you turn it down to 0, it's going to give you exactly what came before it, which is the actual noise. So if we get really close, and let's get into like a intersection point. So I'm using the previous distance node to position myself, and then I'm double clicking back in here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So, right. This is this spot here. So if we go back to our vector warp grayscale and we increase our intensity, let's make sure we double click it. So let's go to 0, and then we're going to do 0.001. You can see that it's starting to warp the texture into different directions. So I'm just going to go up in values of 0.001 so you can see it, because it's very hard to slide this small. So now, if we go back to 0, then we just, Control Z, Control Shift Z to go forward, undo and redo. You can see that it's shifting everything in different directions, and it's basing those directions based on these colors. Just like, red, blue, and green are different axes in 3D modeling. In 2D, it's using all of these color values to be different, like degrees. If you were to think of like, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, whatever, like a circle, every color corresponds to a different direction. So this is very good because it breaks up our texture and it makes it so that we don't have the issue. So if we hide this, like we were saying before, where like this shape was like crossing over, or let's find a better one. Okay, this one. So this shape was crossing over. We don't want that. So by bringing this back, it's going to warp it in a different direction. But obviously we want to do a higher value than 0.01. I will just go with 5 just to get the most. 1 is already enough, but I just like to go extra just to make sure that nothing is in the, they're not anywhere near the original location. Okay. So if we hide this, you can see what it used to look like. So these were sharing one, and then we bring it back, and now it's not anymore. And it knows where to cut off based on this, which we increase the distance. Okay, cool. So now we've broken up the texture. Now the other thing that we have to do is, okay, only do this on the edges of our tiles. So now we have to find a way to find a mask. Everything in Substance Designer is about masks. Um, wherever there's a value of 1 or in between. If you have an in between, then you're kind of telling it to do some in that spot, but 1 will be like subtract it 100% on this spot. And I'll show that uh, in a more visual way soon. Okay, so how can we do that? Okay, we're going to drag off from our tile sampler, and we are going to do, we're going to type in blur, and we want non-uniform blur grayscale. Now, without going too much into this node, we're just going to plug the same thing to the bottom one. So we're going to drag off and do that. Now instantly you see it doing something. If we turn our intensity down, then it's exactly what we had before. So we're going to undo that. And we're going to increase our intensity. But before we do that, actually, we're going to increase our sample and our blades. Whenever you see samples or blades, it's just like a different way of saying like resolution. Don't get mad at me. But that's especially true for samples. The higher the samples, the more resolution you get. So this is, 1, and that's 16. I don't think you can go past 16. Yeah, 16 is the most. And then blades, I don't think blades is exactly resolution, but in this case, it's given us more, which is what we want. So we're going to increase that to 9. I don't think you can go past 9 either. Yeah, so just 16 and 9. You want to go full, full, full. Okay. Now, you're thinking, how is this useful? Well, by looking at this, we have a grayscale where it's higher here than it is here, obviously. And then we have this. So now what tool do we have that we've used so far that can help us here? We could do a histogram scan. But actually, before we do that, we're trying to get a white mask on the edges. But right now, we kind of have a... Here, let's do this. Let's do scan. Let's change this to 0.5. So right now our mask is just a mask on the tiles, which we already have by just going over here. So what we want to do is we want to invert. So if you drag off and hit invert, type in invert, you get this very simple node, invert grayscale. And it does what it says. It just inverts your black and your white. And grayscale too, obviously. Okay, so now we kind of have a white mask. Okay, we're getting closer. And by changing the scan position, we can increase it. So now we are getting the edges, right? If we, just so that we can visualize this, let's do, drag off of this. Don't follow this part, just watch, because I'm going to end up deleting this. So I'm going to change this opacity to 0.5 so that we get half of the foreground and half of the background. So you can see here that if we increase the position on our scan, I can adjust the where I want the edges of my tile to affect. So wherever this white is, that's where our wear, our damage is going to be. So if you want the damage to be like farther in, you can increase the this one. You can increase the position. I want the cuts to be this far in. I want the cuts to be, towards the very, very edge. Then you want to do this. Okay, so let's undo this real quick. Delete this, delete this. Now, there's another node. There's the levels node that I mentioned in the beginning. The level nodes is, well, the scan node is similar to the levels, but the levels node is like the king, and histogram scan is like a version of the level. So if the levels has 5 different settings. The histogram scan only does some of the things the levels does, but level does a lot more. So we're going to use a levels in this case because it gives us more flexibility. So we're going to drag off, and like I said before, first we're going to invert, and then we're going to do a levels. So now here you'll see. So quick little tip. There's this third tab here. If you click this little thing with like what's that, like an abacus or whatever that's called, you can go back between the number value and the histogram. So here you can look at the 2D viewport here. You can slide this to increase like, the range. You can increase the white. You can increase the scale. You can darken, or you can bring the blacks out or lower the whites. So what a histogram scan does is basically, it gives us some of these values. And the reason why there's 2, even though levels can do everything that a scan can do, but a scan can't do everything a level can do, a scan is a little cheaper, I think. And that's why if you know exactly what you need and you only need to use like maybe like let's say these 3 sliders, then you can go for a scan. But technically they're the same thing. You can use the levels to do what a scan can do. And sometimes, what a level can do, a scan can do, but a level has more controls basically. Okay. So now that we have, we're gonna call this one our tiles edge mask. Now that we have this, we are able to use our third input here called opacity. This is just a fancy way of saying, hey, only do this, whatever's happening in this blend, only do it in this mask. So right here we're subtracting, right? And we want to only subtract in this mask. And now we have our mask. So if we drag and connect that there, you can see it's doing something. So if we look at our mask, the inside of the tile is black. Or there's a very subtle gradient going to black, where it's black in the center. So what that means is that only subtract in where the white is. So this is where the white is the strongest, so that's where you're going to see that subtraction the most. And where it's black, you're saying don't do that. So if we disable this, then I'm saying don't do this anywhere, so it looks like this. When I bring it back, I'm saying only do this on the white. So that's why it's more noticeable on the edges, but less in the middle. And you can kind of see it like it's fading out because it's fading out into black. Hopefully that makes sense. The more you do this, the more it'll click for you. Took me a while, that's for sure. Now, if you hold Alt and then follow along a spaghetti strand, you can click and it'll give you like this connector thing, and it helps you organize your your notes. That way you don't have like this going. If you select it and hit backspace, it'll delete it. You don't want to hit delete because it'll disconnect it, but if you hit backspace, it'll make it go away while still keeping the connection. So instead of having this where it makes it hard to, find things, you can do it. You can add a connector here um, to help you keep yourself organized. Okay. All right, great. So now we have everything that we need. We have our mask, we have our damage, you know, great. But now we want this to be a little harsher. We don't want this to be, we don't want this to look like this. I don't know how, it could chip away and have this smooth of a gradient. So we want it to be a little more abrupt. So I looked at my settings before, and whenever I work with the levels node, I'm going to try and hit this thing, the values, so that you can see the exact values that I have. Because I know one thing I find frustrating when I follow other people's tutorials is sometimes they'll just play around with the sliders, which, if you're working not for a tutorial, it's fine because you're just able to like eyeball things. You don't need precise measurements. But as someone that's following, it's hard to like get their position because sometimes their thing is like this far out, and then if yours is tiny, this looks a lot different when it's like this. So just move this back. That's too much. So I'm gonna use this so you can see the exact values that I have. Okay. So I looked at my previous you know my previous tiles, and this is what I did. So I did 0.35 on the level in low. I did 0.6 on the level in high, and I did 0.425 and then 0 and 1. And then I make my mask look like this. So harsh here, and then my gradient is the scale of my gradient is a lot smaller. So now you can see here that it looks more like this. Now this isn't perfect, but it's good enough for our tutorial to give you the idea. So now we are masking our damage to the edges, and you'll get some things like this, which is like, it's okay. From far away, you don't even notice it. But there are ways to like fix that and smooth that. But we're trying to keep this simple and just kind of teach you broad concepts and tools. All right, great. Now, what I'm seeing here is that there's too much. So what we can do is go back to our original crystals noise, and by default it has a scale of 32. Let me go here. By lowering the scale, basically it's just it's not technically the tile ability, but you can make the shapes bigger. So you can see here what's happening. So let's see, what did I do before? 1 second. Okay, I was pretty close. I did 16. Okay. Now another thing I did here is I'm going to select this and select this connector down here, and I'm just going to move it. And then in between the histogram and my blend, I'm going to select this spaghetti, and I'm going to type in another levels. Now what I want to do here is right now, all our damage is being subtracted 100% of whatever value this is. So with our levels, what I want to do is, oops, not that one. You can see here that by lowering the white, we're actually going to make it so that the cuts aren't that deep. Actually, let me look at something else. Okay, so one thing I forgot to do, or we should do, is make these cuts or this damage a little tighter. So we are going to increase the contrast because I don't want it to be this smooth. I want it to be a little tighter. So we're going to move this to 0.85 on the contrast. And then for the position, we're going to do 0.61. Actually, I kind of like this one, but let's see like 0.55 maybe. Let's go back to 0.61. Okay. So yeah, I want the cuts to be a little bit more defined. And then you can, play around with this to your liking. It's not going to change much. Like we're still going to come out with the same thing, just it's just going to look a little different. Maybe even better if you play around with it. Okay. So back to this levels. By lowering, what's this? This is the level out high. We're able to basically determine how deep our cut is going to be. Because if you look at the levels here, we're subtracting a very small amount of white. The more white you cut, the deeper it is. And obviously we don't want this because then this is cutting into like the bottom floor. So we want something like about, I think like here is good. And before I forget, let's look at this thing. Let's just round this down to 0.38. All right. Now the next thing we want to do is now we want to add some damage to the inside of the tile. So, your brain should already be thinking, okay, well, we did it for the outside, now let's do it for the inside. So we're going to type in blend again. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically grab this, copy and paste, and we're going to place it here, move this over here. This thing is going to go on top. This time we're not going to use an opacity because we don't care where these cuts land. So we're just going to plug this in. Don't panic. Let's move this into place. And we just got to change the blend mode to subtract. Now we're going to be getting, since we copy pasted, we're going to be getting the same thing. So first thing to do is we're going to go to our crystal node here and we're going to change the random seed like we did before to 1. And then what we want to do is probably increase the scale. So let's go to like 24. Make them smaller. And then we want to do less. We want to do like smaller damage. So let's say something like that. And again, we can always come back and tweak it. So if you double click here, this is what it looked like after we did our, our missing chunks. This is what it looks like with our edge damage. And then this is what it looks like with our overall damage. And like I said, you can select this one and like disable it. And you'll see here in the viewport and on the 3D what it looks like with or without that specific blend. Okay. Now, next thing I want to do is all our tiles are sitting perfectly at the same height. And obviously, again, it's all about variation. It's all about little details. Obviously, you wouldn't have all tiles sitting perfectly. So we want to introduce some variation to our height, to our individual tile height. We want them to be higher than others. But also importantly, we want some tiles to have a different slope, right? Because land is usually not perfectly flat, especially for when these tiles were made. These are kind of like medievalish tiles. So there's going to be some variation in the slope as well. So that's two things we need. We need height variation and slope variation. Okay. So let's do slope variation. So where did we use slopes before? That's right. in the beginning. But we don't want to use these slopes because these slopes were made for our cuts. We want to do another one, so I'm going to grab this one, copy paste, boom. And I'm going to change the seed to something that I know I haven't used before. So this one is 1, this one is 2, this one is 3, so makes sense to make this one 4. Okay. Now I am going to select this, and I'm just going to type in blend. And then I'm going to drag this and put it on top. Okay, perfect. There it is. We're done. Wrap it up. Okay, so what it's doing, because the middle one's the background and the foreground, I almost said the wrong thing there, then it's just putting the foreground in front of the background. And because the blend mode is set to copy, then it's saying, hey, the foreground goes in front of the background, period. So that's not what we want. So we're going to use a new blend mode, and we're going to use multiply. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult to explain with words, so I'm just going to try and visually explain it to you. So let's do that first. Let's change this to multiply. Okay, look, all our details back. So we might just Shift D, hide. So this is where all of them were like perfectly flat. Then if I bring it back, now some of them are sloping while others are not. Or all of them are sloping in different directions, I should say. Now that's multiply. You don't want to do subtract, because this is what subtract looks like, because you're just kind of like blanket subtracting the slope from everything. And multiply will only do it in specific locations. I will actually put a link in the description to another channel that I actually learned a lot from, where this guy goes over the specific blend types and he explains it really well, better than I can. And it's actually he's super good with the visuals. So I'll put a description there. Shout out to Johnny. Okay, so just know that we're using multiply for this blend mode. Okay, now next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to material, we're going to go to default, and we're going to go to edit again. And now this is where height scale is important. Like I said before, or like I showed before, I'm going to increase my height scale to give us more room. So now we're able to visualize what's happening a little bit more than if this was set to the default 1. You know, the differences are very subtle, but if we increase the height scale, it's still the same values, but it exaggerates it a little bit more. Okay, now this would literally be unwalkable. You just be tripping all over the place. So we want to tweak how much of the slope is actually getting through to the blend mode or the blend node. So I am going to drag out and I'm going to do another levels, and I'm going to hold shift and drag this here. Now what it does is it moves this connection to the end of this one and keeps this connected. So now by increasing the black value, so with this one, if we turn it up, then that means that the slope, instead of ending down here, now I'm increasing the endpoint. So I'm going to make it like about half, like about there. And now we're still getting some slope, but it's not as drastic. It's not as dramatic. So again, I'm going to go back over here, and we're going to do 0.55. Okay, so now we're still getting some, but people aren't tripping. People aren't dying while walking on these. And now that we changed the height scale, this cut now looks a little too deep. I don't know what kind of rock fell in there and made that, but we are going to go back over here. Now this is our inner damage, so it's going to be the second one here. And we're just going to tweak the levels. And we're going to just do about that. Let me show you the values now. So we're going to do 0.2. Before it was 0.38. We're going to do 0.2. And then we're going to go back to the histogram scan here, and we're going to lower our contrast here to 0.75. Just to kind of give it a more slopey, so it doesn't look like too much like this flat. We don't want this flat here. Okay, so now that we have our variance slope, and if you want to have it dramatic, feel free to not go as far here. So we did 0.55. All right, now we need to do the other thing, which was the height variation. We want some tiles to be higher than others because nature. So same thing, we're going to click here, and we're going to type in blend, bring that over here, and we're going to do a little organizing here. And what I'm doing here is I'm lining it up with the middle, because there's usually, these nodes are 3x3, so I'm just putting it in the middle, and I'm keeping the connection straight. If you want to keep yourself as organized as myself. Okay, so now we're going to drag over our flood fill, and then we're going to type in flood fill, and then there's one here called random grayscale. Right here, flood fill to random grayscale. And what this one does is it makes all the islands have a random value between 1 and 0. So now white is obviously higher than 1 is higher than 0. So that means that these tiles are going to be higher than these tiles. So we are going to drag off. If you drag off, hold it, and then press Alt, you create a connector. So put it right there. Well, actually, I would go following this line, it would go right here. And then this will connect here. And then we're going to use multiply again. So some quick paint time. So if we have 1 times 1 gives us what class? 1. 1 times 0 gives us 0. Amazing. So what this means is that if you have a value of white, like 1, not anything in between, which we'll call grayscale. So if we have white and we multiply it by white, we're going to get white. But if we multiply white by black or black by white, which is the same thing, so this is like the pins in the blend, you can swap them because multiply doesn't matter what's first unless you're doing parentheses, which doesn't apply to substance designer. So white times black or black times white equals black. So by understanding this simple concept, what this is going to do when we multiply these values with this, it's going to, these are going to stay the same because it's like you're multiplying by 1, and then these are going to change because they're black. So if you are looking at anything in between, then hopefully you can wrap your head around that. And again, check out that other video. I highly recommend it. It explains this. So if we change this to multiply, you can see here that this one's the darker one. And because it's black or 0, it is going to be lower. So let's see. We're going to go to camera and we're going to go to top view so that it matches our viewport here. And that's this brick or this tile right here, which is this guy. So if we zoom in and we rotate, we see that this guy is lower than all the other bricks because we're doing multiply. If you did subtract, you get a different result because you'd be subtracting white, or you'd be subtracting, since all of these values are above 1 except for this. This is 0. This is not 0. This is like, I don't know, like 0.1 or something. You're subtracting 0.1 from 1, which would give you 0.9. So we give you 0.9. So we don't want subtract. We want yeah, multiply, because otherwise this would be like, okay, subtract, let's say this is like 0.85, then you're subtracting 0.85 from 1, which would give you 0.15, which would make it super low. So we want multiply, because it's also subtracting, it's subtracting it from everything. So it's getting rid of all the detail because it's just flattening it. So we don't want subtract in this case, we want multiply, because we want to keep our details. Okay, but now our variation is a little too drastic again, so same thing. We are going to type select this, and we're going to type in bevels. Or levels, sorry, not bevels. And then we are just going to increase the black values. And I am doing, let's go with 0.4 just to keep it nice and rounded. So now I'm shrinking the gradient or the range. So before, let's say this is like 0.1 and this is 1. With this, I'm making it so this is 0.2, but this is still 1. I'm just lowering what the lowest threshold is. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now we have our height variation and we have our slope variation. So it's looking a lot more interesting. Okay. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm going to look at see what's next. And we're back. Okay. So this will be the end of the height information. So now next is going to be our color, because right now our tiles are gray, are boring gray. One thing I did notice is that my normals were set to 10 in my other one. And as you can see here, the difference is it accentuates or makes it more noticeable than normal. So if we change this to like, let's say 1, the detail is difficult to see. But if we jack this up to 10, it makes everything a little bit more a little easier to see. Okay, cool. Right, so that'll conclude the end of height. And now we're going to move on to base color. So I'm going to just shuffle a couple things here. We don't have any metal in this graph, so we're just going to move metal down here. We're going to move normal down here. I like to keep things really organized, so actually I'm going to move this guy's over here. I like to keep my height in the middle. These guys like that. Boom. Move this down here. And usually I have base color at the top and roughness in the middle. Roughness will be the last thing we do. So let's actually move this higher, because now I'm using, normally I do spacings of 1, but to keep this more organized for you guys, I'm doing spacings of 2. So I'm going to a little bit more extra room.